Hey everyone, this is an article from the Trotsky Reappraisal edited by Terry Brotherstone and Paul Dukes. This piece is titled Trotsky and the NEP by Alec Nove. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. I've never actually read anything. This guy's name is everywhere, and I never learned how to pronounce his name. I'm gonna say it's Alec Nove, but I might be wrong. It might be Alec Nove. Either way, I can't really tell. He's from Russia. He might be born in I think he was born in Russia. I don't know. But doesn't matter. All right, let's party. Actually get to okay. So, here we go. Trotsky and the NEP by Alec Nove. First section, 1920 to 25. Did Trotsky anticipate the NEP by a year? In Trotsky's subsequently published works and in his autobiography, Trotsky states that he proposed in February 1920 that requisitioning be abandoned. There's a special term here, pradrajverstka. Where am I? Pradrajverstka, alternately referred to in English as grain requisitioning, was a policy and campaign of confiscation of grain and other agricultural products from peasants at nominal fixed prices according to specified quotas. This strategy often led to the deaths of many country-dwelling people, such as its involvement with the Holodomor (citation needed) and the Kazakh famines of 1919 to 1922 and 1930 to 33 (citation needed). The term is commonly associated with war communism during the Russian Civil War when it was introduced by the Bolshevik government. However, Bolsheviks borrowed the idea from the grain rezverstka introduced in the Russian Empire in 1916 during World War I. 1916 saw a food crisis in the Russian Empire. While the harvest was good in Lower Volga region and western Siberia, its transportation by railroads collapsed. Additionally, the food market was in disarray as fixed prices for government purchases were unattractive. A decree of November 29, 1916, signed by Alexander Ritich of the Ministry of Agriculture, introduced rezverstka as the collection of grain for defense purposes. The Russian Provisional Government, established after the February Revolution of 1917, could not propose any incentives for peasants, and their state monopoly on grain sales failed to achieve its goal. In 1918, the center of Soviet Russia found itself cut off from the most important agricultural regions of the country. At this stage of the Civil War, the White Movement controlled many of the traditional food-producing areas. Reserves on grain ran low, causing hunger among the urban population, from which the Bolshevik government received its strongest support. Citation needed. In order to satisfy minimal food needs, the Soviet government introduced strict control over the food surpluses of prosperous rural households. Citation needed. Since many peasants were extremely unhappy with this policy and tried to resist it, they were branded as, quote, saboteurs of the bread monopoly of the state and advocates of free, quote, predatory, quote, speculative trade. Citation needed. Vladimir Lenin believed that the Podrazvyortska was the only possible way, in the circumstances, to produce sufficient amounts of grain and other agricultural products for the population of the cities during the Civil War. Bracket, need quotation to verify. Before Podrazverstka, Lenin's 19th of May 1918 decree introduced the concept of, quote, produce dictatorship. This and other subsequent decrees ordered the forced collectivization of foodstuffs without any limitations and used the Red Army to accomplish this. A decree of the Sovnarkom introduced God, I can't pronounce this word, Podrazvyorstka throughout Soviet Russia on January 11th, 1919. The authorities extended the system to Ukraine and Belarus in 1919 and to Turkestan and Siberia in 1920. In accordance with the decree of the People's Commissariat for Provisions on the procedures of Podrazvyorstka, January 13, 1919, the number of different kinds of products designated for collection by the state was calculated on the basis of the data on each gubernia's areas under crops, crop capacity, and reserves of past years. Within each gubernia, the collection plan was broken down between used, Volos, villages, and the separate peasant households. The collection procedures were performed by the agencies of the People's Commissariat for Provisions and proto-triads, food brigades, with the help of kombeds, committees of the poor, and local Soviets. Initially, Podrazverstka covered the collection of grain and fodder. During the procurement campaign of 1919 to 1920, Podrazverstka also included potatoes and meat. By the end of 1920, it included almost every kind of agricultural product. According to Soviet statistics, the authorities collected 107.9 million poods, 1.77 million metric tons of grain and fodder in 1918 to 19, 212.5 million poods, 3.48 million metric tons in 1919 to 1920, and 367 million poods, 6.01 million metric tons in 1920 to 21. Bracket, citation needed. Podrazverstka allowed the Soviet government to solve the important problem of supplying the Red Army and the urban population and of providing raw materials for various industries. Podrazverstka left its mark on commodity-money relations since the authorities had prohibited selling of bread and grain. It also influenced relations between the city and the village and became one of the most important elements of the system of war communism. As the Russian Civil War approached its end in the 1920s, Podrazverstka lost its actuality, but it had done much damage to the agricultural sector and had caused growing discontent among peasants. Bracket, citation needed. As the government switched to the new economic policy, a decree of the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks in March 1921 replaced Podrazverstka with prodnalog, food tax. Back to the text. I'm going to reread the last sentence that I read, because it seems like I got lost there. Did Trotsky anticipate the NEP by a year? In Trotsky's subsequently published works and in his autobiography, Trotsky states that he proposed in February 1920 that requisitioning Podrazverstka be abandoned, that the peasants be allowed to sell freely. The Central Committee turned the idea down, and as Deutscher and Kneippaz point out, Trotsky never returned to his proposal. Trotsky continued, in fact, to be the hardest of the hardliners within war communism. There is no need to quote here Trotsky's well-known and notorious argument for militarization of labor, arguments which Trotsky extended far beyond the immediacies of 1920, since Trotsky saw compulsory labor as necessary throughout the period of transition to socialism. Quote, if it is true that compulsory labor is unproductive in all circumstances, as the Mensheviks assert, then all our construction plans are doomed to failure. End quote. Trotsky. This was also when Trotsky asserted that, quote, the road to socialism lies through the highest concentration of state power, Gosudārstvenost, like a light bulb which, before extinguishing itself, flashes brightly. So the state prior to the state's disappearance takes the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. of the most pitiless state, which coercively elno controls the life of the citizens in all aspects. End quote. Trotsky. I'm going to look up some of these concepts. Okay, not seeing anything for that one. Okay, I'm not finding anything for that one either. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, end quote, Trotsky. In this last quotation, Trotsky anticipates Stalin's view of the coercive role of the state in the period of socialist construction. But presumably none of this excludes the possibility that Trotsky did see the disastrous effects of grain requisitioning on agricultural production and on peasant attitudes toward the Soviet regime. Interestingly, Argumenti e Facti, in number 5, 1990, published a note under the title of The Beginning of the Struggle for the New Economic Policy. In it, the author, S. Pavlyuchenkov, provides evidence that Yuri Laurin had prepared a proposal to abolish grain requisitioning, Brotherstone, and put it to the Third All-Russian Conference of Savnarkozy. Held on the 23rd to the 29th of January 1920. Laurin had the sympathy of Rykov. However, Lenin and Krestinsky strongly opposed even raising the idea and told Rykov to forbid Laurin from proceeding with it. Laurin was dismissed from his membership of the Presidium of the VSNKH Supreme Council of National Economy. The proposal was in fact adopted by that third conference, but the party leadership refused to recognize it and forbade its publication, quote, so as to avoid confusion, end quote. According to Pavlyuchenkov, after the NEP had been introduced, Laurin, quote, ironically stated that for some comrades, the thunder of Kronstadt's guns was needed to awaken them to the need for a new policy, end quote. The article does not mention Trotsky at all, and Trotsky's autobiography does not mention Laurin. There is something here to investigate. Trotsky very foolishly continued his argument with Lenin over the militarization of labor and of the trade unions even as late as the 10th Congress. But when Lenin proposed the first step towards the NEP at this Congress, Trotsky claimed that he, quote, accepted them at once. For me, they were merely a renewal of the proposals which I had introduced a year before, end quote. Trotsky, my life. I'm sorry for all the sniffling and gagging and hacking and wheezing and all that shit. I know it's disgusting, but I'm sick. That quote is from Trotsky's My Life. Did Trotsky accept the NEP in the form into which it developed by the end of 1921? Until Trotsky's expulsion from the Politburo, or perhaps even after that, he was a, quote, NEPist, as asserted by Until his expulsion from the Politburo, or perhaps even after that, was Trotsky a, quote, NEPist, as asserted by Stephen Cohen? Or was Trotsky already fighting against the majority on economic issues as early as 1923, as is claimed by Ernest Mandel? Was Knipaz right in stating that Trotsky, quote, urged not only the rejection of the NEP, but a return to the direct path to socialism, end quote? This view has been repeated by a number of Soviet scholars. For example, G. Vodolazov, in the course of an otherwise admirable contribution to the symposium, Ozmizlivat cult, writes of, quote, the defeat of the attempt to create an administrative command system on the basis of the conception of primitive socialist accumulation by Trotsky and Preobrazhensky immediately after Lenin's death, end quote. A whole school of Russian nationalists has been presenting Trotsky as an arch-villain who advocated all along the policies which Stalin adopted in 1929-30. Thus, according to V. Belov, quote, Stalin was the chief Trotskyist, end quote. That was published in Pravda in the 15th of April 1988. In my view, this is wrong. Stephen Cohen is right. Trotsky did indeed disagree with the Politburo majority, with Bukharin in 1923-25, but at no point did Trotsky question the foundations of the NEP. Trotsky's disagreement centered on other matters. Of course, Trotsky envisaged a socialist future which would be marketless, but in so doing, Trotsky expressed the virtually unanimous view of Bolsheviks and Marxists of the time. NEP was a transition period, sometimes referred to by Trotsky himself as the, quote, transition epoch, end quote, during which the market was essential. When Trotsky expressed concern about the power of the NEP bourgeoisie, or of potentially capitalist elements in the village, here too Trotsky was expressing views held widely in the party. When Trotsky spoke critically at that time about lack of planning, Trotsky did not, as is sometimes alleged, counterpose plan and market. This can be seen vividly in the following quotations, quote, for the next period, which is what interests us practically, we shall have a planned state economy, allying itself more and more with the peasant market, and as a result, adapting itself to the peasant market in the course of its growth. ... Our success ... will depend in large part upon the degree to which we succeed, by means of an exact knowledge of market conditions and correct economic forecasts, in harmonizing state industry with agricultural according to a definite plan ... If the different parts of our state industry, coal, metals, machinery, cotton, cloth, etc., do not mesh with each other, the cost of production will ... include the expenditures of the most inflated branches of industry, and the final result will be determined by the less developed branches. The present selling crisis is a harsh warning that the peasant market is giving us ... The correct work of our State Planning Commission is the direct and rational way of approaching successfully the solution of the questions relating to the Smichka (Workers and Peasants Alliance), end bracket, not by suppressing the market, but on the basis of the market, end quote. Trotsky. All this is from the new course written in 1923. In his speech to the 13th Party Congress on the 26th of May, 1924, Trotsky quoted approvingly a Central Committee resolution to the effect that one can, quote, serve the cause of socialist construction only to the extent that we actually learn to coordinate the sectors of the national economy in the course of their constant interaction with one another and with the market, end quote. Trotsky. And Trotsky went on to deny accusations that Trotsky favored, quote, exaggerated ideas about the possibilities of planned management of the economy, end quote. Trotsky. A year later, at the 12th Party Congress, Trotsky spoke of the need to stimulate peasant agriculture, and that to this end one should encourage the peasant to, quote, get richer. Stalbogacha. Yes, later on Trotsky took exception to Bukharin's 1925 slogan, enrich yourselves, and yes, as we shall show, Trotsky became conscious of danger from the so-called kulaks. But in these respects, too, Trotsky reflected an attitude widespread in the party. As such, historians as Yuri Afanasyev and Gefter point out, was Bolshevik Russia ready to accept the NEP? It is interesting and relevant to the note that some of the best recent studies of how the NEP ended, such as by Yuri Goland, stress the evolution of the party majority, including Stalin, towards positions which conflicted with the logic of the new economic policy, a process which began in 1925 and had nothing to do with Trotsky at all. The same point is made by L. Troparevskaya in Ekonomika I Matematические metody on the 6th of number 6, 1989. Referring to 1926, she writes, quote, the market mechanism towards the end of the classical NEP was retreating before the forces of war communism along the entire front, end quote. In my own article published in Vопроsi Istorии, I listed a number of measures inconsistent with the new economic policy which were adopted in 1926. Clearly, in no sense was Trotsky responsible for them. In Trotsky's booklet, Towards Capitalism or Socialism, published in August 1925, Trotsky remained wholly within new economic policy assumptions. True, in discussing agriculture, Trotsky refers to a, quote, transition from scattered single peasant establishments to a socialist system of land cultivation, end quote, i.e. to the aim to collectivize, but at once Trotsky adds that, quote, this is inconceivable except after passing through a number of stages in technology, economics, and culture, end quote, a distinctly gradualist approach to which Bukharin could have subscribed. New section, 1926 to 28. By 1926, Trotsky is in open, outright opposition to the Stalin-Bukharin line and soon teams up with Zinoviev and Kamenev to form the, quote, united opposition. As already noted, a number of Soviet publicists consider that they were opposed to the NEP. That in, quote, turning left, end quote, in 1928 to 29, Stalin, quote, stole the clothes, end quote, of the left opposition. Some Western historians take a similar view. What was Trotsky's attitude to the NEP when in opposition? First, a few words about, quote, socialism in one country. At the Folonika conference on the 40th anniversary of Trotsky's assassination, I said that Trotsky, quote, might well have agreed that, in the absence of revolution in the West, it was possible to, quote, build socialism, but not to complete the building. Expressing it in terms of Russian grammar, one could use the imperfect but not the perfect aspect, stroit, not poststroit, end quote. Alec Nove. Trotsky collectivization and the first 5-year plan. End footnote. It therefore gave me some quiet satisfaction to find the following in the Trotsky archive. After expressing his opposition to isolationism and excessive autarky, Trotsky continued, quote, "Obviously, the question is not whether we can and whether we want," bracket, these words added by Trotsky in ink, end bracket, "build socialism in the USSR. But in order to postroit, which is postroit socialism, i.e. bring our industry to a high stage of development, and to socialize agriculture on an industrial basis, we would need, in the absence of world revolution, not less than roughly a quarter century." End quote. Trotsky. I agree with Richard Day that, quote, "the operative question for Trotsky was not whether Russia could build socialism in advance of the international revolution, but how to devise an optimal planning strategy, taking into account both the existing and the future international division of labor." End quote. Richard B. Day, Leon Trotsky, and the Politics of Economic Isolation. Day lays great stress on the advantages which Trotsky expected to obtain from expanding foreign trade. True enough, one finds Trotsky writing on the 15th of January 1926 that entering into the International Division of Labor, into, quote, "intensive trade exchanges with capitalist countries, we thereby subject our economy to the criteria of world market productivity and costs," end quote. Then on the 15th of April 1927, we find Trotsky writing, quote, "The attempt to argue that the inevitable development of our links with the world market is for me an argument against the possibility of our socialist development is not only false and dishonest, but also meaningless. I disputed and dispute with theoreticians of an isolated, self-sufficient economy who abstract from the international factor. I proved that our dependence on the world market will grow. The sort of dependency which speeds our tempos of development is in our interest, ... From this follows not lack of faith in socialism, but in my total hostility towards the philosophy of the pace of the tortoise within the four walls of an autarkic economy." End quote. Trotsky. Obviously a kick at Bukharin. But surely Day is wrong in implying that, in the actual situation of the mid-1920s, a large increase in foreign trade was feasible. What could Soviet Russia export? There was only limited amounts of grain and timber available, and the left opposition's peasant policies, of which more in a moment, could hardly be expected to elicit higher, voluntary marketings of farm produce. A word first about the relationship between Trotsky and Preobrazhensky. Some of the accusations leveled against both Trotsky and Preobrazhensky are equally false. Thus, neither advocated robbing or impoverishing the peasantry. Preobrazhensky's view, as can be seen by any reader of his New Economics, was that accumulation by the socialist sector required unequal exchange. But this could be achieved painlessly by cutting the cost of state industry and not cutting or cutting by less the prices charged. And meanwhile, peasant incomes would rise with higher productivity. However, I see considerable difference between Trotsky and Preobrazhensky's attitudes to the market and so to the NEP. Trotsky, at least from 1922 and after his exile, persistently spoke of the market as necessary for the whole, quote, transition epoch, frequently relating plan and market. Preobrazhensky was much more inclined to see a life or death struggle between the, quote, law of value and socialist accumulation, arguing that one must destroy the other. It is then not a coincidence then that when Stalin, It is then not a coincidence that when Stalin turned left, Preobrazhensky abandoned Trotsky and begged for readmission to the party. Also, Trotsky claimed that he had a policy to deal with the looming crisis of the NEP in 1927, whereas Preobrazhensky, in a well-known article published in Vestnik Kommunistiskoy Academy, argued that the contradictions were in fact insuperable without world revolution. Whether in fact Trotsky had a viable policy alternative is another question to be discussed in a moment. Let us look at his peasant policy. Trotsky shared with nearly all Bolsheviks a negative view of the individual peasantry as a class, which could at times secrete capitalism. As was noted by both Bolsheviks and non-Bolsheviks at the time, there was a plain contradiction between the urgent need to increase production and marketing and the view that a prosperous peasant is well on the way to becoming a dangerous class enemy. In 1925, in Towards Capitalism or Socialism, Trotsky feared a development of the productive forces that could take the form of, quote, expansion of the volume of commodity capitalist relations in the village, end quote, which, quote, might be of cataclysmic importance and might shunt our course of development definitely on to the track of capitalism, end quote. Trotsky, the challenge of the left opposition. Towards Capitalism or Socialism by Trotsky. On the 7th of April 1927, we find Trotsky writing, quote, from the point of view of the development of the productive forces, a good harvest is absolutely a good thing. From the point of view of socialist development, the question is ambiguous, ... since it, the good harvest, could be the base of capitalist accumulation, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky was less insistent than was his then ally Zinoviev on the kulak danger. And it is only fair to add that by 1927, even Bukharin was advocating a, quote, offensive against the kulak, end quote, though doubtless without any notion of liquidating them as a class. However, it is not at all unfair to see the left opposition at this time urging the party leadership to take more severe measures against the so-called kulaks. Yet neither they nor any others in 1927 were advocating forcible mass collectivization. The opposition was quick to discern the looming crisis of grain procurements in 1927. They advocated a compulsory grain loan as a short-term expedient. Stalin and his group denied that there was a crisis right through the 15th Party Congress, December 1927, and then resorted to emergency measures reminiscent of grain requisitioning, or Prodrazverstka. But there had been nothing in the opposition's declared policies which would have helped avert the crisis of the new economic policy. Certainly not only their attitudes to the peasantry. They shared the class approach of nearly all Bolsheviks, which in the words of Tsipko caused, quote, monstrous strain in a country in which 80% of the population were seen as an obstacle in the path to an ideal society. Because of this, the leaders of the party had to feel that they were in a besieged fortress, not so much because of capitalist encirclement, but rather because they were surrounded by netmen, markets, a commodity and peasant world, end quote. Tsipko. It is this which enabled Stalin to rally support for his anti-peasant measures. And while the, quote, left had not advocated the measures which Stalin took, nothing in their speeches or philosophy prepared the party members to oppose them. Quite the contrary. The opposition's policies on industry and on prices were also of questionable relevance. Seeking support from the urban working class, which suffered from low wages and unemployment, they could hardly be expected to come out for wage restraint and higher prices. Trotsky is well aware of the, quote, goods famine, which was quite apparent at least from the beginning of 1926, and Trotsky frequently referred to it. As the author in 1923 of the phrase, quote, scissors crisis, Trotsky could not but be aware of the importance of the terms of trade between town and village. Bourgeois specialists such as Nove and Kondratiev issued warnings. Trotsky's remedy, as I understand it, was to urge higher investment and also more foreign trade. The latter suffered from an export unavailability bottleneck, while higher investments required higher savings and some sacrifices in current consumption. Day has argued that if Trotsky had succeeded in getting a higher investment plan adopted in 1925 to 26, the resultant flow of goods would have alleviated the goods famine and so avoided the crisis of the NEP. I see no evidence for this for the following reasons. First, as abundance evidence shows, the comparatively modest attempt to increase the volume of new investment in 1926 was already causing considerable strain on a still weak economy, which had only just recovered from the hunger and destitution of 1921, while the speed-up proposed by Trotsky and demagogically denounced at the time by Stalin as super-industrialization was a mere fraction of what Stalin himself was proposing 2 or 3 years later. It was doubtfully consistent with the preservation of the NEP. Secondly, productive investments take time to bring forth increased output. And thirdly, Trotsky advocated higher investments in heavy industry. Trotsky pointed out in a memo dated the 7th of September 1926 that the plans then under discussion by the so-called OSVOK, the Council for the Restoration of Basic Capital, would still leave output per capita of industrial production in 1929 to 30 below the level of 1913. This would mean the continuation of goods famine. Trotsky then went on, quote, whether the industrialization of a country is proceeding can be seen if there is a relative rise in the share of those sectors which produce means of production, end quote. Trotsky. Peter Bailhartz calls Trotsky a Department 1 or a means of production Marxist, which I think is a funny and very clever way to describe a whole paradigm of looking at social phenomena. Anyway, so higher investments, especially in heavy industry, higher wages. In a note dated 6th of June 1926 to the Politburo, Trotsky complains that, quote, wage rises have been delayed, end quote. Stronger measures against kulaks and no clear challenge to official price policies. Although Trotsky shows himself aware of shortages and disequilibria, this does not seem to add up to a coherent policy alternative, but, of course, Trotsky is only one of a great many oppositionists in many countries who launch destructive criticisms of government policies. It is also necessary to add that, with all their limitations, Trotsky's and Zinoviev's policies were much less unsound than was Stalin's great leap forward. One of Trotsky's problems related to the nature of his, quote, class analysis. The basis of, quote, Thermidor had to be kulaks and netmen. The chief enemy, therefore, had to be the man who, in Trotsky's eyes, was most closely identified with a soft policy towards the new bourgeoisie, that is, Bukharin. Not only did this mean that Trotsky failed to identify the real main enemy, it also meant that Trotsky tended to identify progress towards socialism with the extension of state ownership, with the squeezing out of the, quote, privateer, quite unaware that the growing power of the state over economic life was necessarily accompanied by the growing power of the bureaucracy, and also of Stalin, who stood at its head. Later, Trotsky saw things differently. In exile, he wrote of the bureaucracy, quote, freeing itself from the supervision of the market and of Soviet democracy, ... The innumerable live participants in the economy, state, collective, and private, must make known their needs and their relative intensity not only through the statistical compilations of planning commissions, but directly through the pressure of demand and supply, ... The drafts made in offices must prove their economic rationality through commercial calculation. The economy of the transition period is unthinkable without control by the ruble, end quote. Isn't that from Revolution Betrayed? Well, no, that's from the opposition bulletin. But he says something similar in the Revolution Betrayed. Criticizing peasant policies in that same year, Trotsky argued that collective farming should be based not on coercion, but on personal interest and commercial calculation, adding that, quote, economically sound collectivization should lead not to the elimination of the new economic policy, but to a gradual reorganization of its methods, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1932, edited by George Brightman and Sarah Lovell, 1973. End footnote. Trotsky's view of collectivization and the 5-year plans is not the subject of this paper. I have written elsewhere on this, so I will not pursue the matter further here. Conclusion. The quite numerous Soviet sources which seek to present Trotsky as an enemy and even the gravedigger of the new economic policy are mistaken. Particularly misleading is the use in this context of quotations from Trotsky of the war communism period, since at that time Trotsky's views were shared by Bukharin and indeed in most respects by Lenin too. This is well pointed out by Kleomkin in his path-breaking article in Nove, number 11, 1987, despite which Trotsky's and Preobrazhensky's position continues to be widely misunderstood. Trotsky's position must be seen in the context of the fundamental ambiguity of the entire relationship between Bolshevism and the new economic policy, which has been well explored by Tsipko's 4 articles in Nuka I Jizn. I don't fucking know. Numbers 11 and 12, 1988. Numbers 1 and 2, 1989. Lenin's view, too, is deeply contradictory. Was it the right path or a hateful but necessary retreat? Was it vehicular pour mieux sutur? In his words, something in Russian. They all saw the new economic policy as a transition period of uncertain length, after which the ruling party would renew the assault on the remaining class enemies and transform the economy, peasantry, and society. Trotsky cannot be held responsible for the ending of the new economic policy. Trotsky was out of power after 1925 and played no part in any of many decisions which led to the crisis of the NEP. The same cannot be said of Bukharin. Trotsky saw the new economic policy as a stage in a revolutionary process, and he could not envisage the coexistence in the long run of socialism and markets, but in these respects he did not differ from other Bolsheviks. Trotsky was indeed more internationalist, less inward-looking than the Politburo majority, but this did not make Trotsky into an enemy of the new economic policy. While Trotsky was still in the Politburo himself, Trotsky's ideas on current economic policies differed very little from those of Bukharin. For the reasons advanced above, it seems to me that the policies advocated by the united opposition in 1927 was objectively impractical and represented no solution to the growing crisis within the bounds of the new economic policy, though they did not advocate going beyond these bounds. As Kleomkin was the first to point out in the USSR, Stalin went very much further, quote, left than was ever considered possible or desirable by the left opposition. I put, quote, left in inverted commas because it does seem more than a little perverse to equate the virtual encirclement of the peasant majority of the population with the onward march towards, quote, socialism. That's the end of the article. Thank you so much for listening.